The sky over Montana was a sheet of pale, indifferent blue, stretched so tight and thin it seemed one sharp cry might tear it open. It was the end of autumn, a season of endings, and the mountains hunched on the horizon had the faded, purpled look of old bruises. A wind, born somewhere in the desolate north, swept unimpeded across the vast, rolling plains of golden grass. It was a lonely sound, the only sound, and it rattled the window panes of the solitary ranch house as if testing the resolve of whatever soul remained within. Elias Thorne did not hear the wind, not anymore. It was simply part of the silence he inhabited. At 38, he was a man whittled down by the land and the grief it held. The sun had etched fine cracks around his eyes, and his mouth was set in a line that suggested words were a currency he could no longer afford. He moved with a heavy, deliberate economy that spoke of years of hard labor. His broad shoulders stooped not just from work, but from a weight no one could see. A grief had settled in his bones, dense and cold as river stone. He was mending a fence line, his hands, calloused and competent, twisting the cold, biting wire into place. He worked methodically, his thoughts turned inward, his gaze fixed on the task but seeing something else entirely. The air smelled of pine from the high country and the sharp, clean scent of dry earth. All around him was emptiness. It was not a peaceful void, but an active, oppressive force, a physical presence that pushed in from all sides. His solitude was a thing he wore like a coat, a fortress he had built and was now a prisoner of. Each twist of the wire was a penance, each repaired post a prayer that had long ago gone unanswered. Inside the ranch house, the silence was deeper, more profound. The single large room was clean, brutally orderly, but devoid of any warmth or personal touch. The floorboards were scrubbed bare. The simple wooden table and chairs stood like sentinels. The iron stove was cold and black. It was a space stripped of life, a shell. The only exception was a small, faded photograph propped on the rough-hewn mantelpiece. In it, a woman with a wide, hopeful smile held the hand of a small boy whose laughter was so clear you could almost hear it across the years. They were ghosts, Sarah and Jacob, his wife and son. Sometimes a memory would ambush him, not a gentle recollection, but a sharp, visceral assault. It was never the whole story, just jagged pieces. The smell of smoke, thick and acrid, catching in his throat. The sickening crack of the front door splintering inward. And the sound, the one that haunted the edge of the wind's howl, the one that woke him in the dead of night, his heart hammering against his ribs, a single piercing scream, cut short. It had happened 5 years ago. It was not a grand battle, no heroic last stand. It was a swift, brutal raid by a desperate band of men whose faces he never saw. They had come for horses and food, and they had taken everything else besides. He had been miles away, high in the pastures, checking on a remote section of his herd, oblivious. He had returned at dusk, humming a tune Sarah had loved, to find his world incinerated, his life reduced to ash and a silence that had never left. That day, the man he was had died. In his place was this hollowed-out thing that worked and ate and slept, but did not feel. To feel was to invite destruction, to love, to allow any softness into his life, was to paint a target on it for a cruel and arbitrary fate. The ranch, the endless, grinding work, was his self-imposed sentence. It was his fortress against the agony of memory, a way to exhaust his body so his mind had no energy left to wander back to that smoke-filled clearing. The change, when it came, was not born of desire, but of grim, unyielding necessity. Winter was closing in, a palpable threat in the sharpening wind and the iron-hard ground of morning. The ranch was too much for one man. The cattle needed constant tending. The firewood was never enough. The relentless list of chores grew longer as the days grew shorter. His body, once indefatigable, ached with a deep, persistent weariness. His only neighbor, a grizzled old-timer named Jedediah, had ridden over one afternoon. He was a man who spoke as plainly as the landscape. He sat at Elias's table, took one look at the stark emptiness of the room and the exhaustion etched on Elias's face, and delivered his verdict. "A man is not meant to live like a ghost in his own house. Elias," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp, "you are working yourself into an early grave. You need help. You need a woman." The idea was repulsive. It felt like a profound betrayal, like plowing over Sarah's grave to plant potatoes. He shook his head, a curt, angry gesture. "I do not," he bit out. Jedediah just sighed, a weary, knowing sound. "This is not about what you want. It is about what the winter demands. You will fall, break a leg, and they will find your frozen corpse come spring, or you will lose half your herd. This land does not care for a man's grief. It only cares if he is strong enough to survive it." The old man's words lingered long after he had gone, stark and undeniable. Elias saw the truth in them, a truth as cold and hard as the coming frost, the relentless pragmatism of survival. The creed by which he had lived his entire life began to grind down his resistance. He was a rancher. He knew when a piece of machinery was failing, when an animal needed to be put down, when a field needed to lie fallow, and he knew, with a certainty that settled like lead in his gut, that he was failing. A few days later, a freight driver passing through had left him a bundle of old newspapers to use for kindling. As he was tearing a page from a San Francisco Chronicle, his eyes caught on a small, discreet advertisement in the corner. "Matrimonial Bureau," the heading read. "Dependable, hard-working, and modest wives for discerning gentlemen of the West, companionship and domestic assistance for the frontier life." The language was clean, sterile, transactional. It spoke of assistance, not affection, of dependability, not love. It appealed to the cauterized, unfeeling part of him. He could approach this like buying new livestock or ordering a piece of equipment from a catalog. It was a practical solution to a practical problem. A wife, not as a partner for his heart, but as another hand for the ranch. That evening, by the flickering light of a single lantern, he sat at the table and wrote a letter. It was short, brutally honest, as stark as the room around him. He described the ranch, its size, its isolation, the number of cattle. He listed the work required: cooking, cleaning, mending, tending a garden, assisting with the chickens, and, during calving season, the herd. He made no mention of companionship, of shared evenings by the fire, of a life together. He spoke only of duty and expectation. He stated the sum he was willing to pay for her passage from San Francisco and as a dowry, a significant amount that would ensure the Bureau took his request seriously. He ended the letter with a single, blunt requirement: "I request a sturdy woman of good character, not afraid of hard work." He signed it. Elias Thorne sealed the envelope and felt a wave of self-loathing wash over him, followed by a grim, unwelcome sense of relief. The act felt like a final surrender of the man who had loved Sarah, the man who had laughed with his son. He had commodified the most sacred of bonds. He gave the letter to a passing driver the next morning and tried to put it out of his mind, turning back to his work, to the familiar, punishing embrace of his solitude. Thousands of miles away, the world was a different shape entirely. San Francisco was not a place of vast, empty spaces, but a suffocating warren of humanity. In the heart of the city lay Chinatown, a labyrinth of narrow, crowded alleys where the air was thick with the smells of strange spices, coal smoke, opium, and a quiet, ever-present despair. The noise was constant, a chaotic symphony of shouting merchants, rattling carts, and the musical, alien chatter of a dozen dialects. Here, in a small, windowless room at the back of a gambling den, lived Mei Lin. She was in her early 20s, but her dark, intelligent eyes held a weariness that belonged to someone much older. She moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, a stillness that seemed out of place in the surrounding chaos. Her story was one of broken promises. Her family, scholars from a province in China, had been lured to America, the Gold Mountain, by tales of opportunity. They had found only poverty, back-breaking labor, and the cold, unyielding wall of prejudice. Her father, a gentleman who had once composed poetry, had been killed in a dispute over a day's wages on the railroad. Her mother, her spirit broken, had withered from sickness not long after, orphaned and alone. Mei Lin had been sold by a distant, gambling-addicted uncle. He had used her to settle a debt with Jin, the charismatic but monstrously cruel leader of a local tong. Life under Jin was a gilded cage, a waking nightmare. He did not use her for his own pleasure. His cruelty was more refined than that. He saw her as a beautiful, valuable object, a symbol of his power that was to be polished, controlled, and eventually sold to the highest bidder. She was kept in her small room, trained in the arts of serving tea, of playing the guzheng, her slender fingers plucking mournful tunes for his associates. She endured his constant psychological torment, his subtle threats, the way his smile never reached his cold, reptilian eyes. The threat of violence was a constant presence, a shadow in every corner of the room. But her spirit, the core of her being, was not broken. It had retreated deep inside, a tiny, unyielding flame in a vast darkness. She was intelligent, observant, and possessed a strength that Jin, in his arrogance, had failed to see. She was playing a long game, a kindly old cook, a man who saw the ghost of his own daughter in her eyes, took pity on her, in secret, in hushed whispers late at night. He taught her to read and write English, using discarded newspapers and shipping manifests. Knowledge, he told her, was a weapon they could not take from her. Her opportunity arrived wrapped around a bundle of fish delivered to the Tong headquarters. It was a page from a tattered San Francisco newspaper. As she cleaned the fish, her eyes fell upon a small advertisement, a matrimonial bureau, a place called Montana. The words were simple, direct. A man needed a wife for his ranch. He was offering payment. To Mei Lin, it was not a promise of love or happiness. It was a lifeline out of hell, a remote ranch in a place called Montana. The name itself sounded strong, like the mountains she tried to imagine. It sounded like a fortress of solitude, a world away from Jin's suffocating grasp, a place so vast and empty she could disappear into it. With the old cook's help, she began her desperate gamble. She crafted a reply, her English careful and formal. She chose an anglicized name, Lily, a name as simple and unassuming as the woman she pretended to be. Her letter was as sparse and practical as Elias's. She was a simple, capable woman, she wrote. She was not afraid of hard work. She agreed to his terms. She omitted every detail of her true identity, her circumstances, her life of terror. It was a lie, but it was a lie that might set her free. The cook helped her steal a small pouch of money from Jin's treasury, a crime punishable by a slow and painful death. One night, when the coastal fog rolled thick and heavy through the alleys, shrouding the city in a gray blanket, she slipped out. She navigated the labyrinthine streets to the address from the newspaper, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The matrimonial bureau was a shabby office, a front for an operation that dealt in human lives, and she navigated its predatory bureaucracy with a steely calm she did not feel. She paid them what little she had and instructed them to use the funds Elias had wired to secure her passage. Before Jin could even discover she was gone, Mei Lin was on a train, heading east, disappearing into the vast, unknown heart of the American continent. The journey was arduous, a new kind of terror. She was a lone Asian woman in a sea of suspicious, staring white faces. The train car was a rolling cage of hostility. She endured the taunts whispered just loud enough for her to hear, the lingering, predatory stares of the men, the open contempt of the women. She retreated into a shell of silence and invisibility, making herself as small as possible, her gaze fixed on the window. And there, the world began to change. The claustrophobic, crowded city gave way to rolling hills, then to vast, endless plains that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The sheer scale of it was both frightening and awe-inspiring. She watched the landscape unfold, a raw, untamed, and magnificent tapestry. She saw herds of buffalo that flowed like a dark river across the grasslands, and sunsets that set the entire sky ablaze. For the first time in years, A fragile, tentative sliver of hope took root in her heart. This land was vast enough to hide in. It was vast enough to start a new life. She clutched a small, smooth stone in her pocket, a memento her mother had given her long ago. It was her only link to a life before the trauma, a life she could barely remember. The final leg of the journey brought her to redemption, a small, bleak settlement that clawed its existence from the dust. The train depot was little more than a wooden platform in a shed, windswept and desolate. Elias was already there, waiting. He had been for an hour, his impatience a cold knot in his stomach. He regretted the entire damnable affair. He felt a fool, a desperate man who had bought a pig in a poke. He paced the platform, his boots kicking up clouds of dust, earning curious glances from the few other people waiting. The train arrived with a great hiss of steam and a groan of brakes. Elias scanned the disembarking passengers, a knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. He was expecting a stout German woman, or perhaps a hardy Irish girl with red cheeks and strong hands. He was expecting someone plain and sturdy, like a draft horse. Instead, he saw her. She was small, almost bird-like, dressed in a simple, dark traveling suit that seemed too large for her thin frame. Her face was pale with exhaustion, her jet-black hair pulled back in a severe, tight knot. And she was Chinese. The shock was a physical blow. He felt it in his gut, a hot surge of anger. He had been deceived, swindled. The advertisement had said nothing of this. Around them, he felt the atmosphere shift. The townsfolk on the platform stopped their conversations. Their stares were open, hostile, a palpable force of suspicion and contempt. He heard the whispers begin, ugly words that slithered through the air. Mei Lin saw the shock on his face, the immediate, hard tightening of his jaw. She saw the way his eyes, the color of a winter sky, narrowed with fury. Then she saw the hatred in the eyes of the townspeople surrounding them, and her fragile sliver of hope withered and died, replaced by a familiar, cold dread. She had escaped one prison only to walk willingly into another. With a deep breath, she straightened her back, schooling her features into a mask of careful neutrality, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. She stood before him, waiting. Elias, his face a thunderous mask, stalked towards her. He did not speak a word of greeting. He snatched her single, small cloth bag from her hand and gave a curt, angry jerk of his head toward his waiting wagon. Follow. The silence on the long ride to the ranch was a living thing, thick with his unspoken anger and her unspoken fear. He felt the weight of the money he had spent, a fool's price for a problem he did not know how to solve. He had bought and paid for this woman, this strange, foreign creature sitting stiffly beside him. She was his responsibility, his shame. Mei Lin sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The unforgiving landscape rolled by, the jagged peaks of the mountains like a row of broken teeth against the sky. She understood with perfect, chilling clarity that her escape was not over. Her fight for survival had only just begun. As the sun began to dip low, the wagon crested a final hill. Below them, nestled in a wide, lonely valley, was the ranch house. It was a small, solitary speck in an immense, wild, and hostile world. It looked less like a home than a gravestone. The first days at the Thorn Ranch passed in a silence so profound it seemed to have a physical weight. Elias showed Mei Lin her room with a curt, dismissive gesture. It was a small, Spartan space adjoining his own, a former storage room containing little more than a narrow cot, a washstand with a chipped porcelain bowl, and a single hook on the wall for her meager belongings. A thin wall separated their spaces, and the unspoken question of marital duties hung in the air between them, as palpable and suffocating as dust. But Elias, recoiling from a grief that was still a raw, open wound and a deep, simmering anger at the deception he felt, made no move to address it. His door remained firmly closed. He treated her not as a wife, but as a hired hand he could not fire, an unwelcome fixture in his own home. Their interactions were stripped to the bone of necessity. Each morning at dawn, he would stand in the main room and deliver a clipped, impersonal list of chores, his eyes fixed on a point on the wall just over her shoulder. The chicken coop needs mending. Weeds are taking the vegetable garden. Floors need scrubbing. Then he would turn and leave, his heavy boots echoing his departure, and she would not see him again until he returned for the evening meal, which they ate in the same strained silence. He avoided looking at her directly, as if her face were a mirror reflecting his own folly. He felt cheated, swindled by the fast-talking charlatans in San Francisco. He had paid for a solution, and they had sent him a problem, a woman he did not want, could not understand, and who, by her very existence, made him an outcast in his own community. His anger simmered just beneath the surface, a low, constant heat that he banked with endless, punishing work. Mei Lin, for her part, retreated into a mode of pure survival she had perfected long ago. She had lived under the thumb of a monster who thrived on fear. A sullen, silent rancher was a threat she knew how to manage. She became a creature of quiet, relentless motion. She rose before the sun, her slight form a moving shadow in the pre-dawn gray, and worked until long after sunset, when her muscles ached with a fatigue that was almost a comfort. Her efficiency and tirelessness were a silent rebuke to his prejudice, a constant, unspoken demonstration of her worth. She was a quick study. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, observing Elias's methods from a distance, anticipating his needs before he voiced them. She learned the particular way he liked his coffee, the precise time he brought the cattle in from the lower pasture, the way the back door swelled in the damp and needed a firm shoulder to close. The house, under her meticulous care, began a slow, subtle transformation. The floors, once dull with grime, now gleamed with a soft luster, the scent of baking bread, something the cabin had not known in 5 years, sometimes filled the air, a warm, wholesome ghost of a happier time. Elias's pile of mending, ripped shirts and worn trousers, shrank and disappeared, the repairs done with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She did not speak unless spoken to, and when she did, her answers were soft and brief. Her face was a carefully constructed mask of quiet deference, but beneath the mask, her mind was a fortress. She was constantly assessing, learning, watching. She cataloged the ranch's resources, the state of their supplies, the patterns of the weather in the unforgiving sky. She was steeling herself, preparing for a winter she knew would test them all. Her only solace was found in the small, neglected vegetable garden behind the house. There, in the stubborn, rocky soil, she coaxed life. Her hands, digging in the cool earth, remembered the gardens her mother had once tended, a lifetime ago. She found a strange peace in the orderly rows of beans and squash, a small patch of the world she could control and nurture. A fortnight after her arrival, their supplies ran low, forcing a trip to the town of Redemption. The journey in the wagon was silent, but it was nothing compared to the wall of silence that met them when they arrived. Redemption was a collection of dusty, clapboard buildings and suspicious people, a town held together by a rigid social code and a shared, deep-seated distrust of anything or anyone different. It was a microcosm of the era's fears, a place where prejudice was mistaken for piety. When Elias and Mei Lin walked into Abernathy's general store, the low hum of conversation ceased as if a switch had been thrown, every eye in the place fixed on Mei Lin with a hostile, violating curiosity. Mr. Abernathy, a man with a perpetually sour face, nodded curtly to Elias but refused to so much as glance in Mei Lin's direction, his gaze sliding past her as if she were a ghost. Women clutched their shopping baskets and pulled their children closer, shielding them as though Mei Lin carried a virulent plague. The air grew thick with unspoken contempt. Outside, the situation turned uglier. As Elias was loading sacks of flour into the wagon, a group of local drunks, who spent their days propped against the saloon wall, saw their chance. They were led by a belligerent, pot-bellied man named Caleb. They swaggered over, their faces flushed with cheap whiskey and casual malice. "Well now, Thorne," Caleb sneered, his eyes raking over Mei Lin. "See you got yourself some new livestock." His companions snickered. They began to openly mock her, making exaggerated, nonsensical sounds meant to imitate her language, their faces twisted in cruel pantomime. Elias's reaction was a tangled knot of shame and rage. He was angry at them, at their ignorant cruelty, but a darker, more confusing anger was directed at Mei Lin. It was her presence that had brought this upon him, her face that was the cause of his humiliation. He did not defend her. He did not speak a word in her defense. Instead, his face became a thunderous mask. He finished loading the last sack, grabbed her by the arm, his grip harder than necessary, and ordered her back to the wagon. "Get in," he growled. The ride home was fraught with a new, heavier kind of silence. Mei Lin sat rigid, staring straight ahead, the men's mocking jeers echoing in her ears. It was a familiar sting, the sharp pain of ostracization that had followed her since the day she first set foot in this country. But this was different. She looked at the hard set of Elias's jaw, the white-knuckled grip he had on the reins. His silence was not a shield for her, it was a wall for himself. He was not her protector, he was her keeper. That cold, hard realization settled in her heart. She was utterly and completely alone. She could rely on no one but herself. The incident did not break her, it galvanized her. From that moment on, her purpose sharpened. She would not just work, she would make herself indispensable. She would make her practical value to him so great that it would outweigh the social price of her existence. She would become a net positive in the cold arithmetic of his life. Despite the icy distance between them, small, almost imperceptible cracks began to appear in the facade of their arrangement. They were not grand gestures, but tiny, quiet moments that passed almost without notice. One evening, after a long day of rounding up stray cattle that had wandered into the high country, Elias slumped at the dinner table, a picture of pure exhaustion. An old shoulder injury, a souvenir from a fall years ago, was aching with a dull, throbbing pain that radiated down his arm. He barely touched the stew she had placed before him. Mei Lin watched him for a moment from the shadows near the stove. Then, without a word, she disappeared into her small room. She returned a few minutes later with a small, steaming bundle wrapped in a clean cloth. It was a poultice of herbs she had gathered from the foothills, their strange, earthy scent now filling the small cabin. She placed it on the table beside his plate and retreated back to the kitchen. Elias stared at it. Then he looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his tired eyes. He did not thank her. He did not acknowledge the gesture at all. But later that night, long after she had gone to her room, he pressed the warm, fragrant poultice to his aching shoulder. The heat and the herbs worked a slow magic, soothing the deep, burning pain. He started to notice other things about her, the way she moved with a quiet, fluid grace that made no sound on the wooden floors, the sharp intelligence in her watchful eyes, which seemed to miss nothing. One afternoon, he found her in the barn, calmly reassembling a complex piece of the reaping machine that he had been struggling with for weeks. A crucial gear had stripped, and he had been planning another long trip to Redemption to order a new part. She had repaired it with a length of baling wire, a small piece of hammered tin, and her own quiet ingenuity. It worked perfectly. He stood in the doorway and watched her wipe the grease from her hands, a confusing mixture of astonishment and something else, something that felt dangerously close to respect, stirring within him. One night, the screech of a barn owl from the rafters, a sharp, hunting cry in the darkness, pierced the veil of her composure. The sound was a key. Unlocking a door in her mind she fought to keep bolted shut. In an instant, she was no longer in a Montana barn. She was back in Jin's opulent, suffocating house in San Francisco. The memory was sharp, detailed, and painful. She saw the silk tapestries, the intricately carved furniture, the air thick with the sweet, cloying smell of expensive incense. It was a beautiful prison where she was forced to serve Jin and his sneering associates. Her face a porcelain mask, her hands steady as she poured their tea, her mind screaming. The memory focused on a single, crystalline event that had become the core of her trauma. A rival of Jin's had gifted him a songbird, a tiny creature with iridescent blue feathers, housed in a delicate bamboo cage. Its song was the most beautiful sound Mei Lin had ever heard. Jin, in a casual demonstration of his absolute power, decided to starve the bird. He enjoyed its weakening song, he said, the growing desperation in its notes. Mei Lin could not bear it. At great risk to herself, she began to sneak food to the bird each night, a few grains of rice, a drop of water, for a few days. The bird's song grew stronger, a small, defiant note of beauty in that house of ugliness. But Jin was observant. He discovered her small act of rebellion. He did not beat her. His cruelty was more precise. He brought her to the cage, a serene smile on his handsome face. Then, as she was forced to watch, he reached inside, took the fragile bird in one hand, and slowly, deliberately, broke its wings. The bird gave a single, terrified chirp. He then broke its neck with a flick of his thumb and tossed the tiny, lifeless body onto the floor at her feet. He had knelt down, his voice a soft, silken whisper against her ear. "Everything beautiful that you try to care for will be broken, little bird," he had told her. "You are mine to care for, and mine to break." That memory had crystallized her understanding of the world. It had forged her deepest defense mechanism. To care was to invite punishment. To nurture beauty was to ensure its destruction. Back in the present, huddled in the Montana barn, the owl's cry fading into the night, she shuddered. This internal world informed her every action. She saw the ranch, the animals, even the taciturn, broken man in the house, as things to be cared for. But she did so with a profound emotional distance. Her care was practical, a matter of survival, not affection. She was the songbird, singing a quiet, useful song in a new cage, terrified of drawing the master's notice. As autumn bled into winter, the landscape became more brutal. The first snows dusted the high mountain peaks, a white warning of what was to come. The wind carried a new, sharper edge that cut through clothing and chilled the bone. The work on the ranch became a frantic race against the encroaching season, a desperate effort to prepare for the long, isolating months ahead. During a particularly bitter cold spell, one of the older cows gave birth. The calf was small and weak, and the mother, sensing its fragility, rejected it. She nudged it away and refused to let it nurse. It was a death sentence. Elias found the shivering creature in the morning, its coat already stiff with frost. He saw it as a lost cause, an unfortunate but necessary casualty of ranch life. His pragmatism was a cold, hard blade. There were limited resources, limited time. Wasting them on a creature that was almost certain to die was foolish. "Leave it," he said, his voice flat. "The coyotes will have it by nightfall." He turned to walk away, but Mei Lin, who had followed him to the barn, did something she had never done before. She defied him. "No," she said. The word was soft, but it hung in the frigid air with the weight of iron. He stopped, turning to look at her. Her face, usually a mask of calm deference, was set with a stubborn, unyielding resolve. Before he could repeat his order, she moved. She knelt, gathered the freezing, barely breathing calf into her arms, a weight that was nearly half her own, and struggled with it into the relative warmth of the main barn. She spent the entire night there. She wrapped the calf in her own shawls, sacrificing her warmth for its. She built a small, smoky fire in an old bucket, using it to warm the milk Elias had left for their own use. She spent hours massaging its frozen limbs, forcing its blood to circulate, whispering to it in a language he did not understand. Elias found her there at dawn. He had woken to a house colder than usual and realized she was not in her room. He found her in the dim light of the barn, curled on a bed of hay next to the calf. She was asleep, her face pale with exhaustion. But the calf was alive. It was shivering violently, but it was alive, and it was trying to nuzzle her hand. He said nothing. He simply stood in the doorway and watched her. He saw not just a stubborn woman, but something deeper, a fierce, primal instinct to preserve life. No matter how fragile or hopeless it seemed, he saw the ghost of a defiant act, a secret kindness in the face of absolute cruelty, though he could not know the story behind it. For the first time, what he felt for her was not anger or resentment or even grudging respect. It was something more unsettling, a stirring of awe. He turned and went back to the house. A few minutes later, he returned. He set a bucket of fresh, warm milk and a clean, thick wool blanket just inside the barn door, where she would see them when she woke. Then he walked away. The foundations of his own internal fortress shaken to the core by a quiet, impossible act of defiance. The barn held a small, fragile point of warmth and life, a flickering candle against the encroaching cold of the Montana winter, and the vast, icy distance between the woman who nurtured it and the man who had bought her. Winter did not arrive. It descended. It came down from the mountains not as a gentle dusting of snow, but as a sudden, violent assault. One afternoon the sky turned the color of lead, and a wind with the voice of a hungry animal began to howl across the plains. Then the world vanished. A massive blizzard fell upon the region, a swirling, shrieking vortex of white that erased the horizon, the mountains, and the sky itself. The Thorn Ranch was no longer a solitary point in a vast landscape. It was the entire world. The universe shrank to the four walls of the cabin, the nearby shadow of the barn, and the blinding chaos that raged around them. The snow came down in a relentless, horizontal torrent, burying the fence lines Elias had so carefully mended, piling in massive drifts that pressed against the doors and crept up the walls. The wind was a constant, physical presence, a battering ram that shook the very foundations of the small house. This forced confinement acted as a crucible. The silent routines and carefully maintained distances that had defined their relationship were stripped away. There was no escape, no work in distant pastures to occupy the long hours. They were trapped, with only each other for company, their survival entirely dependent on their cooperation. The sensory details of the storm became the rhythm of their lives, the relentless, deafening roar of the wind, the eerie, diffused gray light that filtered through the snow-caked windows, and the profound, pressing silence when the gusts momentarily died down, a silence that felt heavier and more charged than the noise itself. Initially, the confinement only exacerbated the tension. They moved around each other in the small, cramped cabin like wary predators, hyper-aware of every breath, every footstep. The space was charged with unspoken thoughts, with his resentment and her fear. The days became a long, monotonous cycle of essential tasks, keeping the fire in the iron stove fed and roaring, melting buckets of snow for water, carefully rationing their dwindling supply of food. It was during this period of forced proximity that Elias was compelled to truly see Mei Lin for the first time. She was no longer just a collection of duties or the silent, foreign symbol of his social problem. She was a person, a presence that filled the small space with a quiet, focused energy. He found himself observing her, his gaze lingering when he thought she was not looking. He watched her quiet rituals, the way she carefully measured out their daily ration of flour, tapping the cup to ensure not a single grain was wasted, the almost magical skill she had in turning a meager portion of salted pork and a few root vegetables into a hearty, savory stew, the focused calm with which she sat by the firelight in the evenings, her slender fingers deftly mending a tear in his shirt with stitches so small they were like whispers on the cloth. He began to see not a servant, but a woman of immense and quiet competence. The first major turning point of their confinement came from a crisis born of the storm's fury. The wind had ripped a section of shingles from the barn roof, and the snow was blowing in, threatening their livestock and their precious store of hay. The cattle were growing restless, their lowing a mournful sound beneath the shriek of the wind. Elias knew he could not wait. Bundled in his heaviest coat, he fought his way through the blizzard to the barn. The work was brutal. The wind tore at him, driving ice crystals into his face that felt like needles. He managed to secure a tarp over the hole, his fingers growing numb and clumsy in the biting cold. Heading back to the house, visibility was almost zero. The world was a churning maelstrom of white. He misjudged the path, his foot sinking deep into a freshly formed snowdrift. Beneath the soft powder, his boot caught on a half-buried piece of rusted farm equipment, the broken tine of an old harrow. He twisted, his entire weight coming down on his leg as a sickening, tearing pain shot up from his calf. He cried out, a sound instantly swallowed by the wind. He managed to pull his leg free, but when he tried to stand, the limb buckled beneath him. He looked down and saw the dark stain spreading rapidly across his snow-covered trousers. He knew it was bad. Gritting his teeth against the waves of pain, he began to drag himself back towards the house, a slow, agonizing crawl through the deepening snow, leaving a crimson trail that was quickly covered by the storm. He collapsed just inside the door, slamming it shut against the blizzard's roar, his face pale and contorted in agony. He lay there on the floorboards, the tough, self-sufficient rancher who had prided himself on his strength, brought low by a single moment of carelessness. Mei Lin's reaction was immediate and decisive. The fearful, subservient bride vanished, replaced by a woman of stunning, unflappable competence. She was at his side in an instant, her small frame surprisingly strong as she helped him stumble the few feet to his bed. With a sharp knife from the kitchen, she cut away the blood-soaked fabric of his pant leg, her movements precise and unfaltering. The wound was deep and ragged, a gaping gash just below his knee that bled profusely. Elias, his senses swimming in a haze of pain, tried to wave her off. "It's just a cut," he grunted through clenched teeth. "I can handle it." Mei Lin ignored him completely. She stoked the fire, putting a pot of water on to boil. She returned with the steaming water and a bottle of whiskey. "This will hurt," she said, her voice quiet but firm, leaving no room for argument. She cleaned the wound, her touch gentle but sure. The whiskey felt like liquid fire, and a raw cry of agony was torn from the stoic rancher's throat. Then she revealed another of her hidden skills. She went to her room and returned with a small, carefully wrapped oilskin bundle. She unrolled it on the small table beside his bed. Inside were collections of dried herbs and roots she had harvested from her garden and the nearby foothills, along with a clean needle and a spool of fine silk thread. She worked quickly, grinding some of the herbs into a paste. "This one will dull the pain," she explained, her voice a low, steady murmur as she applied the paste to the edges of the wound. "This one will keep the sickness from setting in." He watched, astonished, as she threaded the needle and, with the focused concentration of a surgeon, began to stitch the ragged flesh together. Her brow was furrowed, her hands steady, her work meticulous. The act of tending to him was profoundly intimate, a complete reversal of their established dynamic. For days, he was completely at her mercy. A fever set in, a consuming fire that left him weak and delirious. During that time, she was his constant caretaker. She spoon-fed him broth when he was too weak to lift his head. She changed his bandages, cleaning the wound with a diligence that kept the infection at bay. She sat by his bedside through the long, dark nights of the storm, the only sounds the howl of the wind outside and his own fevered breathing. In his delirium, the carefully constructed walls around his heart crumbled to dust. He murmured names she had only ever seen on the faded photograph on the mantelpiece. Sarah, Jacob. His grief, so long suppressed, poured out of him in broken, half-intelligible phrases. The smoke, so much smoke, Jacob, run, Sarah. He tossed and turned, his hands reaching for ghosts only he could see. Mei Lin listened silently, her heart aching, night after night. She sat in the flickering lamplight, piecing together the fragmented story of his tragedy. She felt a deep, piercing pang of empathy for this broken, tormented man. She recognized his pain as a different shape of her own, a loss so profound it had hollowed out the world. She was no longer afraid of him. Beneath the callous, angry exterior, she saw the wounded soul, a man trapped in a prison of his own making, just as she had been. One night, the storm outside finally exhausted itself, the wind quieting to a low moan. Inside, his fever broke. He woke in the dead of night, his mind clear for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The room was cold, the fire having burned down to glowing embers. He turned his head and saw her, asleep in the hard wooden chair she had pulled up beside his bed. Her head was slumped at an uncomfortable angle, her face pale and shadowed with exhaustion in the faint moonlight filtering through the window. A damp cloth was still clutched in her hand. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and felt a powerful, unfamiliar surge of emotion. It was a complex wave of gratitude so immense it almost choked him, of awe at her strength and skill, and something else, something deeper and more potent, a fierce, protective tenderness. Slowly, carefully, he reached out with his good arm. His hand hesitated for a moment, hovering in the cold air, before he gently took the edge of the wool blanket on his bed and pulled it over her shoulders. It was the first truly gentle gesture he had ever made towards her. She stirred, a soft murmur escaping her lips. But she did not wake. The moment was silent, profound, and it marked an undeniable shift in the foundations of their world. The transaction was broken. In the crucible of the storm, a human connection had been forged. As Elias slowly recovered his strength, the atmosphere in the cabin transformed. The silence between them was no longer hostile or strained, but comfortable, companionable. He would watch her as she moved about the cabin, his gaze filled with a new and profound respect. And he began to talk. At first, it was just small things. He told her stories about the ranch, about his father who had built the cabin with his own hands, staking his claim in this wild, unforgiving land. He spoke of the challenges of raising cattle, of reading the signs of the weather, of the harsh lessons the mountains taught. He was, in essence, sharing his world with her, opening the door to his life, a door that had been sealed shut for 5 long years. One evening, as the last of the blizzard raged outside, they sat by the fire. He motioned to the small pouch of herbs she kept on the mantelpiece. "Where did you learn all that?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. "The herbs, the stitching." The question opened a door for her in return. She spoke softly, her eyes on the dancing flames. She told him about her mother, who had been a healer in their village in a land so far away it felt like a dream. She described how her mother had taught her the names of the plants, their secret properties for healing and for harm. She spoke not of the horror of her time in San Francisco, but of the life she had lost, of the green, terraced hillsides of her home, of a world of beauty and tradition that had been stolen from her. It was the first time he had heard her speak at such length. He was captivated by the soft, musical cadence of her voice and the deep, ancient sadness in her story. A few days later, the blizzard finally subsided, the wind died, and a profound silence fell over the land. The sun emerged, weak at first, then brilliant, setting the new world ablaze. They stood together at the window, looking out at a landscape transformed. Everything was covered in a thick, pristine blanket of white. The beauty of it was breathtaking, a clean slate, a world washed pure. Elias turned from the window to face her, his expression serious, his eyes clear and direct. "I owe you my life, Lily," he said, the name he had been given for her, the name from the letter. She looked up at him, her gaze unwavering. "My name is Mei Lin," she replied softly. It was not a correction, but a quiet, powerful declaration. She was claiming her identity, the one that was truly hers. The name sounded foreign and beautiful in the quiet room. He tasted it on his tongue, repeating it in a near whisper, "Mei Lin." Then he did something that shattered the last remaining vestiges of their old arrangement. He told her everything. He did not just recount the bare, brutal facts of the raid. He spoke of his love for Sarah, of her laughter that used to fill the silent cabin. He told her about Jacob, about teaching his son to ride, about the dreams he had held for their future, dreams that had turned to ash in a single afternoon. And he spoke of the guilt, the all-consuming, suffocating guilt that had haunted him every day since, the guilt of being away, of not being there to protect them. He confessed his deepest fear, that allowing himself to care for anyone again was an open invitation for that catastrophic loss to strike once more. His confession was raw, painful, and utterly honest. It was an offering of his broken heart. Mei Lin listened, her own heart aching with a shared sense of loss, of lives irrevocably broken. When he finally finished, his voice thick with unshed tears, his gaze fixed on the floor. She did not offer empty platitudes or words of comfort. Instead, she did something much more profound. She reached out and placed her hand gently on his forearm. It was the first time they had ever touched by choice, not by necessity. The contact was like a spark, a jolt of warmth and connection that passed between them, chasing away some of the deep, persistent cold. "Grief is a ghost that walks beside you," she said, her voice a low, steady anchor in the quiet room. "You do not have to let it walk alone." In that moment, they were no longer a rancher and his purchased bride. They were two survivors, two lonely souls who had found an unexpected and profound anchor in the middle of a storm. The physical desire that had been simmering unspoken beneath the surface of their tense cohabitation was now intertwined with a deep, unbreakable emotional intimacy. It created a powerful, unspoken bond, a fragile new beginning that would soon be tested by the harsh, unforgiving world that awaited them outside the snowbound cabin. The spring thaw was not a gentle awakening, but a violent tearing away. The world that had been muffled and pure under the blizzard's blanket was now exposed, raw and vulnerable. The snow retreated in dirty, pockmarked patches, revealing a landscape of mud and bruised earth. The creeks swelled into angry, churning torrents, their waters the color of rust. The fragile sanctuary Elias and Mei Lin had built in the heart of the storm felt just as exposed, its quiet intimacy threatened by the rush of the world returning. Their first trip back to redemption confirmed their deepest fears. The atmosphere in the town, once thick with a passive, simmering suspicion, had curdled into something openly hostile. The long, isolating winter had been a breeding ground for rumors, and in the absence of facts, the townsfolk had woven a narrative of their own dark imaginings. The sight of Elias, now walking with a permanent, noticeable limp, and the silent, foreign woman at his side, was all the proof they needed. The narrative was led, as most things in redemption were, by the town's self-righteous and opportunistic preacher, Reverend Miller. He was a man with thin lips and the eyes of a hawk judging a field mouse, a man who saw God's will in his own ambitions. From his pulpit, he had spent the winter painting a picture of Mei Lin not as a woman, but as a heathen sorceress, a creature of the Orient who had bewitched the grieving rancher with her strange ways and pagan spells. Elias's injury, the story went, was no accident. It was the mark of her malevolent influence, a physical manifestation of his spiritual sickness. The townsfolk, needing a scapegoat for their own harsh winter struggles, for the livestock lost to the cold, for the sickness that had taken two of their children, were eager to believe it. It was easier to blame the outsider than to accept the random cruelty of the land. This growing animosity was no longer just a matter of whispers and sideways glances. It had tangible, ugly consequences. At Abernathy's general store, several essential items from their order were conveniently forgotten when the goods were loaded onto their wagon. A new axe head, a sack of seed grain. It was a small, petty act of sabotage, but a clear message. The message became clearer still when Elias went to the blacksmith to arrange for a new plow blade. He left Mei Lin waiting on the wagon, her head bowed, trying to make herself invisible. But invisibility was no longer an option. Caleb, the town drunk, and his two loutish cronies, saw her alone and swaggered over, their shadows falling over her like a cage. Well, Caleb slurred, a foul grin spreading across his face. "Thought I'd get a closer look at Thorne's new property. You fetch a high price, girl?" He reached out a grimy hand, intending to grab her arm. Before his fingers could touch her, a hand like an iron vice clamped down on his wrist. Elias had returned, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. He said nothing. He simply twisted, forcing Caleb to his knees with a cry of pain. Then he shoved the man hard against the rough-hewn wall of the saloon. The other two men took a stumbling step back, their drunken courage evaporating in the face of Elias's silent rage. Elias leaned in close, his voice a low, dangerous growl that cut through the sudden silence of the street. "She is my wife," he said. the words clear and deliberate, a public declaration for all to hear. Touch her again, and you will answer to me. He released Caleb, who slid down the wall into a heap. Elias turned his back on them, helped Mei Lin down from the wagon, and stood by her side as he finished his business. His presence a clear, unyielding shield. The town watched. A line had been drawn in the dust of Redemption's main street. A Rubicon had been crossed. Elias was no longer passively enduring their prejudice. He was actively, publicly fighting it. The act thrilled and terrified Mei Lin in equal measure. In all her life, no one had ever stood for her. To be claimed, to be defended with such fierce certainty, sent a jolt of warmth through her that was almost painful in its intensity. But she also saw the looks on the faces of the onlookers. She saw the way their resentment hardened into pure hatred. He had not extinguished the fire. He had thrown fuel on it. In defending her, he had painted a larger, clearer target on both of their backs. As if the town's hostility were not enough, a new and far more sinister threat materialized a few weeks later. A stranger passed through Redemption. He was not like the other travelers who sometimes stopped for supplies. He was slick, well-dressed in expensive city clothes, with manicured hands and a watchful, intelligent gaze. He said he was a representative from a San Francisco trading company, exploring new routes. He asked subtle questions in the saloon and the general store, questions about the outlying ranches, about any newcomers who might have settled in the area over the winter. He asked, with casual precision, about a young Chinese girl. The townspeople, particularly Reverend Miller and a still seething Caleb, were all too willing to help. They saw in this sophisticated stranger a potential ally, a man from the outside world who might help them rid their community of what the Reverend had started calling the foreign blight. They pointed him in the direction of the Thorn Ranch. The stranger did not approach the ranch. He observed it from a distance for a full day, hidden in a grove of cottonwoods on a high ridge. He watched Elias and Mei Lin moving about their work, his expression unreadable. Then, his task complete, he disappeared as quietly as he had arrived. Mei Lin caught a glimpse of him. She had been checking on the cattle in the upper pasture and saw the glint of sunlight off the lens of his spyglass. A cold, paralyzing dread seized her. She did not recognize the man, but his fine clothes, his posture, his calculated, watchful manner, it was all terrifyingly familiar. It was the scent of Jin's world, a harbinger of the life she had fled. She tried to dismiss it as paranoia, a phantom of her past, but the fear gnawed at her, a cold serpent coiling in her gut, the new intimacy she shared with Elias. The fragile peace they had built was the most precious thing she had ever known. The thought of her past reaching across the country to destroy it was an agony beyond imagining. The atmosphere of encroaching danger, both from within and without, intensified the emotional tension between them. The cabin, once her prison and then their storm-bound crucible, was now their only safe harbor in a hostile world. In the evenings, with the door barred, they would talk for hours. They shared more of their histories, filling in the silent spaces that had once separated them. He taught her the names of the constellations that glittered in the vast, clear Montana sky, the hunter, the bear, the North Star that had guided her journey. She, in turn, taught him a few words in her native tongue, the soft, musical sounds a stark contrast to the harshness of their lives. The desire between them was a constant, humming presence, an electrical charge in the small space. There were moments when they worked together in the barn, their hands brushing as they passed a tool, and the air would crackle with unspoken want. There were evenings when he would watch her in the firelight, her face softened by the warm glow, and the urge to close the final distance between them, to touch her, to claim the intimacy their hearts had already forged, was almost overwhelming. But he held back. A part of him, the old, wounded part, was afraid that acting on his desire would somehow break the spell of their fragile peace, and deeper still, a subconscious terror remained, the fear of loving completely, of giving his whole heart, only to have it ripped away again. The town's hostility finally escalated from simmering resentment into a direct act of violence. A sickness, a wasting fever, began to spread among the cattle of a neighboring rancher. A man named Henderson, who was one of Reverend Miller's most devout followers. The cause was likely a tainted water source, a common affliction in the spring. But the Reverend saw an opportunity. That Sunday, he delivered a fiery sermon, his voice ringing with righteous fury. He proclaimed the sickness God's judgment, a plague sent to punish the community for tolerating a heathen presence in their midst. He spoke of cleansing, of cutting out the rot before it could corrupt them all. He whipped the town into a righteous frenzy, their fear and ignorance a tinder for his inflammatory words. That night, they came. A mob of 12 men, their faces illuminated by the flickering, demonic light of torches, rode to the Thorne property. They did not have the courage to attack the house directly. Instead, they rode to the large hay barn, the structure that held the ranch's lifeblood, the entire winter supply of feed for the cattle. With hateful shouts and whoops of triumph, they set it ablaze. Elias and Mei Lin were woken by the roar of the fire and the sound of the mob's retreat. They burst out of the cabin to see the hay barn engulfed in a column of swirling flame that reached for the night sky. Panic seized the animals in the main barn next to it, their terrified cries a heartbreaking chorus. There was no time for thought, only action. They worked desperately, side by side, a single unit forged in crisis. The heat was a physical blow, the thick, acrid smoke choking them, but they moved with an instinctive, coordinated grace. While Elias fought to break open the main corral gate, Mei Lin ran into the smoke-filled barn, her small frame darting among the panicked, kicking animals, untying them, driving them out into the open pasture and away from the spreading flames. They managed to save all the livestock, but the hay barn was a total loss. They stood together, covered in soot and sweat, and watched it burn until it collapsed into a mountain of glowing embers. The cowardly act of destruction was complete. The aftermath of the fire was a final, terrible turning point, standing amidst the smoking ruins as the sun rose on their devastation. Elias's face was a mask of cold, unadulterated fury. The flicker of hope he had harbored for a peaceful existence was extinguished. He now understood with absolute clarity that there could be no peace with the town. They were on their own, an island in a sea of hate. His protective instincts towards Mei Lin, already strong, now became absolute, a steel band around his heart. He looked at her smoke-stained face and the fierce, defiant light in her eyes, and a profound realization washed over him. He was not just protecting a woman he had come to care for, he was protecting his entire world, because she had, quietly and completely, become its center. He made a decision. He took her by the arm and led her into the main barn, the air still hazy with smoke. From the pegs on the wall, he pulled down his heavy Winchester rifle. He checked the action, his movements deliberate and grim. "This is no longer just about fences and cattle, Mei Lin," he said, his voice low and hard as granite. "They will be back. You need to know how to use this." He began to teach her. The lessons were intense, stripped of all softness. He showed her how to load the cartridges, how to work the lever action, how to sight down the long barrel. The kick of the heavy rifle against her small shoulder was a brutal, bruising force. The explosive crack of the gunshot made her flinch, her ears ringing, but she set her jaw, her expression hardening into one of fierce concentration, and she learned. The act of him teaching her to shoot was deeply symbolic. He was not hiding her away. He was entrusting her with a tool of survival, making her a partner in their defense, not a damsel to be protected. As he stood behind her, his arms coming around her to help steady her aim, their bodies pressed close. The heat between them was more intense than the fire they had just fought. His chest was hard against her back, his breath warm on her neck as he murmured instructions. The danger that surrounded them, the intimacy of the lesson, and their shared, desperate purpose stripped away the last of their reservations. The simmering desire held in check for so long was now forged by the fire and the threat of violence into a sharp, desperate need for each other. They both knew, with a certainty that needed no words, that a final confrontation was coming. They did not know from which direction the enemy would appear, from the town or from her past, but they knew they would face it together. The part ends late that afternoon, with Mei Lin alone in the pasture, practicing with the rifle. She stood with her small frame steady against the vast, empty landscape, her eyes fixed on the distant, hostile horizon. The setting sun glinted off the long steel barrel. She was no longer a victim, no longer a refugee. She was a survivor, readying for war. The storm arrived in the late afternoon, not on the wind, but as a stain spreading across the western sky. The bruised, purple-gray clouds boiled over the mountains, swallowing the pale blue of the day in a slow, ominous tide. The air grew still, heavy, and charged with an electric tension that made the hairs on their arms stand up. The birds fell silent. Then the first low rumble of thunder echoed from the high peaks, a distant, guttural growl that was a promise of violence to come. The storm was a physical manifestation of the dread that had been tightening its grip on them for weeks. It trapped them, sealing their small valley from the rest of the world, cutting them off from any potential for flight or help. The rain began as a tentative, whispering drizzle. Then, as darkness fell, it became a torrential, relentless downpour. The world outside the cabin windows dissolved into a churning chaos of water and wind, and the ranch yard was quickly transformed into a sucking sea of mud. They had finished their meager supper in silence, the storm's growing symphony a tense counterpoint to the quiet crackle of the fire. They were both on edge, a shared, unspoken anxiety stretching between them. Every creak of the cabin, every shriek of the wind, was a potential threat. The first sign came from the barn. A horse screamed, a sharp, terrified sound that was brutally cut short. It was not the sound of a spooked animal. It was a cry of agony. Elias was on his feet in an instant, the half-eaten plate of beans forgotten. He moved to the wall, his limp barely noticeable in the fluid, urgent motion, and took down the Winchester. He did not need to speak. He met Mei Lin's wide, dark eyes across the room, and they exchanged a look of grim, absolute understanding. The enemy they had been waiting for, the ghost from her past, or the hatred from the town, had arrived. Under the cover of the storm's deafening onslaught, Jin and his 3 henchmen had come. They were not the brutish, whiskey-soaked thugs of redemption. They moved like shadows, their dark oilskin coats shedding the rain, their steps silent and purposeful in the mud. They were coldly efficient predators, and at their head was Jin himself. His face, handsome and serene in the intermittent flashes of lightning, held a charismatic charm that made his cruelty all the more monstrous. His voice, when he gave his quiet orders, was more menacing than any shout. They had used the information from their scout well, and they knew from the town's ripe gossip that no one from Redemption would be riding to the aid of the Thorn Ranch. Their goal was simple: reclaim their stolen property and make a punitive example of the farmer who had dared to take her. The ranch itself, with its livestock and meager valuables, would serve as a fine for his transgression. Their siege began with a campaign of subtle terror. The horse had been the first casualty, its throat cut not to create noise, but to demonstrate a silent, deadly proficiency. While one man disabled the animals, another moved to the well, the rope slicing through with a single, clean cut of a knife. The water barrels near the house, full from the recent rain, were tainted with a fast-acting poison from a small vial Jin carried. Their final preparatory act was to the ranch dog, a scruffy but loyal creature who had grown fond of Mei Lin. He met them with a low growl, which was silenced by a quick, brutal blow that broke his neck. Each act was a deliberate psychological blow, designed to isolate, to weaken, to strip away the tools of survival and the comforts of home before the true assault began. The fight for their lives began in earnest when a bullet splintered the wooden window frame just inches from Elias's head. The cabin, their sanctuary, instantly became their fortress. "Bar the door," Elias commanded, his voice low and steady as he levered a cartridge into the rifle's chamber. Mei Lin did not hesitate. She slammed the heavy iron bar across the main door and moved to the windows, forcing the wooden shutters closed and securing them with their latches, plunging the cabin into a near-total darkness, lit only by the firelight and the strobing, spectral flashes of lightning from outside. The next few hours were a tense, violent ballet of attacks and defenses. Gunshots exploded in the night, their sharp cracks almost indistinguishable from the crashing thunder. Elias was a formidable defender. He was a man born of the frontier, and his home was an extension of his own body. He knew its every strength and weakness. His movements were economical and deadly, firing sparingly through the small gun ports he had built into the walls years ago, never wasting a shot, making each one a calculated response to a muzzle flash in the darkness. But it was Mei Lin who proved to be the surprise, the unknown variable in Jin's cold equation. She was not a passive, weeping victim waiting for rescue. She was a warrior defending her first true home. Her intelligence, honed by years of silent observation, became their most potent weapon. "The floorboards by the west wall," she said, her voice a low, urgent whisper in the chaos. "Your father used it for storage. There is a gap. They can see our feet." Elias, who had completely forgotten the old root cellar entrance, immediately shoved a heavy chest of drawers over the spot. She seemed to know the cabin's vulnerabilities better than he did. She created makeshift weapons, putting a great cauldron of water on the fire to boil, ready to be thrown at anyone who breached the door. She armed herself with a long, heavy fireplace poker, its tip glowing a dull red from the heat of the embers, and she used her small stature to her advantage, moving silently from one shuttered window to the next, peering through the smallest cracks, her eyes sharp and accustomed to the dark. She became his spotter, his second set of eyes, whispering warnings. "Two men, by the remains of the hay barn. One is moving towards the back." Her calm under fire was unnerving. She did not tremble. Her hands were steady, her voice never wavered. Elias, catching a glimpse of her face in a flash of lightning, saw a woman of terrifying resolve. He was not just impressed, he was humbled. She was not just fighting for her life, she was fighting for this life, the one they had begun to build together. The battle raged, a stalemate of wooden walls against relentless attackers. Then, a new sound cut through the storm, a man's voice, old and familiar, shouting from a distance. "Elias! Elias, you in there? Saw the fire the other night. Came to check on you." It was Jedediah, stubborn, good-hearted Jedediah. Elias's blood ran cold. He scrambled to a gun port and peered out. In a brilliant flash of lightning, he saw his old neighbor on horseback at the edge of the ranch yard, completely unaware that he had ridden into a war zone. "Jedediah, get back!" Elias screamed, but his voice was swallowed by a deafening clap of thunder. Before he could shout again, a single muzzle flash bloomed from the darkness near the barn. Jedediah slumped in the saddle, a look of profound surprise on his face. He slid from his horse and fell into the mud with a soft, final thud. His horse, panicked, bolted a few steps before another shot brought it down. The entire sequence was swift, brutal, and utterly, senselessly cruel. A raw, guttural cry of pure rage and grief was torn from Elias's throat. Jedediah had been his last real link to the community, a gruff but kind presence in his lonely life. His murder was a stark, bloody testament to the absolute ruthlessness of their attackers, and to the totality of their isolation. No one was coming to help. No one even knew. The attackers, now impatient, saw their opportunity. Using the body of Jedediah's horse as cover, they advanced across the muddy yard, reaching the front porch. The heavy thud of an axe began to bite into the thick wood of the front door. The fighting was about to become close quarters, a desperate, final stand. A bullet punched through the wall, tearing a hot, searing line across Elias's left arm. The pain was sharp and sickening, and blood began to soak his sleeve. He was weakening, the adrenaline that had sustained him now warring with the shock of the wound. He glanced at his ammunition pouch. They were running low. The situation felt hopeless, the walls of their fortress closing in like a coffin. It was in this moment of ultimate desperation, with the axe biting deeper and deeper into the door, that the emotional climax of their lives erupted. There was a lull in the attack, the chopping sound stopping abruptly. Then a voice called from the porch, a voice that was not one of the henchmen. It was smooth, cultured, and laced with a poison that was more terrifying than any shouted threat. Jin was speaking, and he was speaking to her in her native dialect. The familiar, hated words slithered through the splintering door, a serpent from a past she thought she had escaped. He taunted her, his voice a silken caress of cruelty. He reminded her of her powerlessness, of the songbird with the broken wings. "You see, little bird," he called, the endearment a vile mockery. "Everything you touch is destroyed. This fine house, that foolish old man in the mud, this broken farmer who bleeds for you, it is your nature. You bring ruin. Come out to me now, and I will let him live." Inside the cabin, Mei Lin looked at Elias. He was pale from blood loss, his face grim as he fumbled with his last few cartridges, his movements slowed by his wounded arm. She saw the wreckage of their home, the splintered wood and shattered glass. She heard the lie in Jin's voice, a lie she knew better than anyone. And in that moment, something inside her, some final deeply buried shard of fear, did not just break, it was incinerated, it was burned away by a cold, pure, clarifying rage. She turned to Elias, her eyes blazing in the firelight with an intensity that stunned him. This was the moment of her undressing. It was not a physical act, but a violent, emotional stripping away of every pretense, every defense, every layer of fear she had worn for years just to survive. "You paid for me," she said, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a white-hot intensity. Her English was stark, clear, and strong. "You paid for a docile wife, to cook your meals and clean your floors. You thought you were cheated." She moved closer, her small frame radiating a power he had never seen. She reached out and grabbed the front of his blood-stained shirt, her grip surprisingly strong. "My family was murdered. I was sold like an animal. That man out there." She gestured with her head towards the splintering door. "He owned me. He taught me that to survive. I had to be invisible, silent, worthless." Her voice cracked on the last word, a single raw note of her immense pain, but she pushed on, her eyes locking with his. "That is the woman you paid for, Elias. Now I will show you why." She released him, her meaning hanging in the air between them, sharp and clear as a shard of glass. Why she was sold, why she was so valuable to a man like Jin. Why this terrible violence had followed her across a continent to their doorstep. It was a confession of her trauma, but it was also a fierce, undeniable declaration of her will to live past it. Elias looked at her, and in that instant, he did not see a Chinese bride. He did not see a victim. He did not see the woman he had resented. He saw a warrior, forged in a fire he could barely imagine, a woman of impossible, heartbreaking strength. His own loss of control was not one of lust, but a seismic, explosive release of every emotion he had brutally suppressed for 5 long years. His grief for Sarah and Jacob, his crushing guilt, his profound loneliness, and the fierce, overwhelming, protective love he felt for this woman, it all coalesced into a singular, blinding fury. He pulled her to him, his uninjured arm wrapping around her like a steel band. He crushed his mouth to hers in a desperate, possessive kiss that had nothing to do with romance. It was a branding, a promise, a vow sealed in gunpowder and blood. It tasted of salt and desperation and a love so fierce it defied the death that was hammering at their door. He broke the kiss, his forehead resting against hers, his breathing ragged. "You are not his," he snarled, his voice raw with an emotion that was part love, part rage. "You are mine." And the word mine was no longer about a transaction, no longer about ownership. It was about belonging. He was hers, and she was his. They were a single entity against the world. Fueled by this emotional explosion, a desperate, final plan formed in his mind. It was a suicide mission, but it was their only chance. "The back window," he said, his voice urgent. He pushed the rifle into her hands. "I will use the last of these to keep them at the front. You go out the back. Run. Create a diversion. Just run, and do not look back." He was determined to give her a chance to escape, to buy her life with his own. He turned from her, the grim, determined smile of a man who had finally, after 5 long years, found something worth dying for again. As Mei Lin slipped towards the back window, a shadow in the raging storm, Elias turned back to face the splintering door, ready to make his last stand. The world outside the back window was a churning, violent chaos. The noise was a symphony of destruction, the crashing thunder that vibrated in her bones, the ceaseless roar of the pouring rain, and the rhythmic, splintering sound of the axe biting into the front door of the cabin. Inside, Elias stood his ground, a grim silhouette against the firelight, firing his last precious shots to draw the full attention of their attackers to the front. He was a man prepared to die, a final, defiant bulwark to buy her a chance at life. But Mei Lin did not flee as instructed. As she slipped out into the storm, the cold mud sucking at her boots, a ferocious will to live, a will she had not known she possessed, blazed up inside her. It was intertwined with a love for the man in the cabin so powerful it eclipsed a lifetime of fear. To run would be to abandon the only home she had ever known, the only person who had ever seen her. It would be to let Jin win. She would not run. She executed a desperate, wild plan. She did not run away from the cabin, she circled it. She moved through the darkness and the driving rain, using her knowledge of the terrain and the storm's chaos as her cover. She was no longer the frightened, porcelain girl from San Francisco. The soft edges had been stripped away, burned off by hardship and fire. She was now a creature of this harsh Montana wilderness, as resilient and unforgiving as the land itself. Her target was the woodpile near the side of the house, a place the attackers, focused on the front, had ignored. Her hand closed around the familiar, worn handle of the felling axe. Its weight was a solid, comforting thing in her grasp. Moving with a predator's silence, she crept along the cabin wall, the rain plastering her hair to her face, her heart hammering a steady, resolute beat against her ribs. She saw him then, one of the henchmen, his back to her. He was crouched, reloading his pistol, his attention fixed on the splintering front door where his companions were working. He was waiting for the breach, for the moment they would storm the cabin and end it. In that moment, he was utterly vulnerable. Mei Lin raised the axe. The act was not born of hatred, but of a grim, terrifying, absolute necessity. It was a brutal calculation for survival. She brought the axe down in a swift, powerful arc. The sound was a sickening, muffled thud, lost in the greater noise of the storm. The man crumpled without a sound, a dark shape disappearing into the mud. This single, decisive act was the diversion Elias needed. The other attackers, hearing the sound and realizing one of their own was down, were momentarily confused, their rhythm broken. That split second of hesitation was all Elias needed. He burst out of the cabin, not in the suicidal charge Jin expected, but in a low, tactical sprint, diving for the better cover offered by the stone wellhead in the center of the yard. The final confrontation erupted in the open, a primal, chaotic battle waged in the mud and the driving rain. Lightning flashed, illuminating the scene in stark, intermittent tableaus of violence. Elias, though his arm bled freely and his ribs ached with a deep, throbbing pain, fought with the strength of a man unburdened. The ghosts that had haunted him for 5 years had been exorcised by the promise of a future. He was no longer fighting his past. He was fighting for a tomorrow with her. He moved with a deadly grace, and in the chaos, he managed to take down another of Jin's men. Now it was only Elias and Mei Lin against Jin, the charismatic, serpentine leader, seeing his carefully laid plan crumble, his men dispatched by a broken-down farmer and a slip of a girl, finally lost his cool, theatrical composure. His face twisted into a mask of pure reptilian fury. He lunged, not for Elias, but for Mei Lin, seeing her as the root of his humiliation, the property that had dared to have a will of its own. "Mei Lin!" Elias roared, and threw himself in front of her. He was not fast enough to stop the attack, but he was fast enough to take it. Jin's knife, intended for her, slashed across his ribs, a deep, burning line of fire. As Elias stumbled back with a grunt of pain, Jin seized his chance. He grabbed Mei Lin, spinning her around, his arm a vice around her neck, the cold steel of the knife pressed against her throat. This was the final standoff. "Drop your weapon, farmer," Jin sneered, his face close to Mei Lin's, his breath foul. "Or watch her die." But he had made a fatal error, the error of a man blinded by his own arrogance. He had forgotten the lesson he had tried to teach her with the songbird. He believed that to hold something was to own it. He believed he had broken her, that she was nothing more than a terrified, beautiful object. He was wrong. As he held her, his grip tightening, Mei Lin's hand, hidden from his view, closed around the object she had picked up from the mud near the porch, a jagged, sharpened piece of metal from the broken harrow that had first injured Elias. With a guttural cry that was part rage, part terror, part a lifetime of suppressed fury, she drove the shard of metal with all her strength into his side, just below his ribs. Jin screamed, a high, strangled sound of shock and agony. His grip on her loosened for a fraction of a second. It was the only opening Elias needed, ignoring the fire in his arm and his side. He launched himself forward, tackling Jin with the full force of his body. The two men went down in the churning mud, a tangle of limbs and desperation. The fight was brutal, ugly, and short. It was not a duel of skill, but a raw struggle for dominance. It ended with Elias, driven by a surge of adrenaline and a pure, savage love, finally overpowering the man who had haunted Mei Lin's life, his hands closing around Jin's throat, silencing his evil forever. As if on cue, the storm broke. The torrential downpour softened to a drizzle, and the thunder retreated, grumbling, into the distant mountains. As the first pale, watery light of dawn spread across the sky, a profound, exhausted silence fell over the devastated landscape. Elias and Mei Lin stood over Jin's body, covered in mud and blood, their breathing coming in ragged, shuddering gasps. The threat was over. They were alive. They turned to each other and clung together, not in passion, but in a desperate, trembling affirmation of survival, their bodies shaking with the aftermath of the violence they had endured and enacted. Slowly, they surveyed the damage. The dawn light revealed a scene of utter devastation. The dead men sprawled in the yard, their bodies stark and still in the mud, the gentle, peaceful form of their neighbor Jedediah, a good man who had paid the ultimate price for his kindness, the bullet-riddled, splintered walls of their cabin, the smoldering, skeletal ruins of the barn. The cost of their freedom, of their future, was laid bare in the cold morning light. The immediate aftermath was a series of quiet, deliberate actions, a ritual against the encroaching shock. They dragged the bodies of their attackers to a far corner of the property, a grim task performed in near silence. Then, with a tenderness that bordered on reverence, they gently carried Jedediah's body to his own wagon. Elias promised him a proper burial, a promise to honor the memory of the only man in redemption who had shown them a shred of decency. Inside the wrecked cabin, they tended to each other's wounds. The ritual of care was no longer one-sided. She stitched the deep gash on his ribs as he had seen her do on his leg, her hands steady despite her exhaustion. He, in turn, cleaned and bandaged the cuts and bruises she had sustained. His touch, once hesitant, now gentle and sure. In the battered but defiant sanctuary of their home, surrounded by the evidence of the battle they had won, they finally had the conversation that had been building since the blizzard. All the remaining secrets, all the unspoken fears, were laid bare in the quiet morning. He spoke her name, Mei Lin, and it was no longer a foreign word, but a prayer. She traced the lines of his weathered face, seeing not just the stoic rancher, but her protector, her partner, her home. This raw, painful, emotional honesty led to their first act of love. It was not a scene of fiery, triumphant passion, but one of deep, quiet, healing intimacy. Amidst the wreckage, they came together, an act of claiming each other, of reclaiming their own bodies from the trauma they had endured. It was a gentle, desperate, and beautiful affirmation of life in the face of so much death, a final sealing of the vow they had made in the heat of battle. The weeks and months that followed were a slow, arduous process of rebuilding. The sheriff from Redemption eventually rode out, a portly, pragmatic man who had seen his share of frontier justice. He took a cursory look at the scene, at the mounded graves on the far hill, and listened to Elias's clipped, edited version of events, a story of self-defense against a band of robbers who had murdered his neighbor. The sheriff looked from Elias's steely gaze to Mei Lin's quiet, unshakable presence at his side, saw the unassailable unity between them, and decided to close the case. The world was simpler without complicated paperwork. The town remained divided. Reverend Miller continued to preach damnation from his pulpit, speaking of the devil's work at the Thorn Ranch, but others, hearing of Jedediah's death in their defense and seeing the couple's quiet resilience as they began to rebuild, felt a grudging respect, or perhaps a quiet shame for their own cruelty. The Hendersons, the neighbors whose cattle had recovered from a common spring sickness, silently left a slab of cured bacon on the Thorns' porch one morning, a small, unspoken gesture of peace. The final scene took place many months later. In the full bloom of the following spring, the land, like them, was coming back to life, covered in a carpet of green shoots and wildflowers. Elias and Mei Lin were rebuilding the barn, working side by side in the warm sun. The physical scars had faded to pale lines, and the deeper, emotional ones were healing, knitting together in the shared rhythm of their new life. There was an easy, unspoken peace between them, the comfortable silence of two people who understood each other completely. He was teaching her how to handle the cattle, her small frame surprisingly adept at the work. She was planting a new, larger garden, a mix of American vegetables and the Chinese herbs her mother had taught her about, their roots mingling in the rich Montana soil. The prejudice of the world had not vanished. It was still there, a distant shadow on the horizon, but it no longer defined them. It could not touch the world they had built on this small, hard-won patch of land. As the sun set, casting a warm, golden light across the valley, Elias finished his work and came up behind Mei Lin. She was standing at the edge of the new garden, looking out over their land. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. She leaned into his embrace, her head resting on his shoulder. They did not speak. They simply stood together, watching the sky blaze with color. Two survivors who had found in each other not what they had paid for, not what they had expected, but everything they needed to become whole. Their love was not a fairy tale. It was a testament to resilience, a quiet, hardy, and beautiful thing that had taken root and blossomed in the most unforgiving soil. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know where you are tuning in from in the comments to connect with fellow listeners. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.